For a few minutes tonight, I want to talk about the just shall live by faith. This is a statement that we came across on Wednesday night in our study of Hebrews. We noticed how this statement comes out of the all but forgotten prophet of Habakkuk. And so, since Habakkuk is all but forgotten, I'd like to remind us a little bit tonight about Habakkuk and the context of this statement, and draw out some very important lessons for us as Christians. The statement as it is used in Hebrews chapter 10 comes across as something that those saints would have been familiar with. The statement from Habakkuk is used 3 times in the New Testament, suggesting that Christians were familiar with Habakkuk and this statement, and there's reasons for that, and hopefully we'll be able to notice some of that tonight. Just at the outset, though, I want to say a couple of things about this statement and the 3 passages in the New Testament where it is found. There's 2 meanings to this statement. There's 2 ideas that come out of this statement. First of all, justification. The concept of justification and explaining justification is how Habakkuk is used in 2 places in the New Testament, in Romans chapter 1 and in Galatians chapter 3. This statement is talking about the just. The question what might be raised, well, who are the just? Well, it's, how if someone can be just, how are they made just? Justification has to do with someone who's been declared to be in the right. It's a legal term. It's a legal term. When a verdict is rendered that the accused is in the right, thereby being justified and pardoned from the consequence of sin. That's how it's used here in Romans chapter 1 about how the just would live by faith. And Galatians chapter 3 is a very clear example of it. The point being that you and I are not justified by our works. There's nothing that you and I can do to earn our salvation. There's nothing you and I can do to reach a point in life where God will say, you're doing pretty good. You're justified now. We're justified by faith, by believing in what God accomplished for us through His Son and our Savior, Jesus Christ. That's a very important concept. It's one that is technical and doctrinal in nature. That is not the sense in which it is used in Hebrews. Hebrews brings an entirely different idea, which is more to its original context in Habakkuk. The just shall live by faith is a statement of endurance. It is telling how the just who are living in a wicked, fallen world are to live. They live in trust of God. Despite the fact the rest of the world has turned away from God, they are going to rely upon Him. The people that were living in the days of Habakkuk, those who were just, there were a few of them, had very difficult lives. And as hard as they were, things were just going to be made harder. So the lesson for us is a lesson about learning to rely on God. So about that, living by faith. Living by faith takes patience. It takes patience. Let me give you a little information about Habakkuk. Habakkuk was a prophet for which there is very little known. We don't have much information at all about his background, who he was. We do know that he lives during the final days of Judah, which was a very wicked time, a very unjust time to live. And Habakkuk's writing is a lamentation. And a lamentation we think of probably from Jeremiah or the Psalms, where a tragedy has happened and someone is trying to process and understand the tragedy. Even more so, there are complaints that are made in a lamentation directed toward God. Someone doesn't understand why God is doing what He's doing, or why he's not doing what the writer thinks he ought to be doing. But a lamentation is not just a complaint. It's not just an expression of intense agony, but it is born of faith that God will make all things right. So, Habakkuk begins with the complaint. Habakkuk doesn't understand how God has allowed his people to deteriorate morally and ethically in the way in which they had. Habakkuk wants God's people to be straightened out. So there's a response that God gives to Habakkuk at the end of the first chapter, in which he tells him that he's going to raise up the Chaldeans. The Babylonian Empire is going to come and punish the people. Well, then Habakkuk complains about that. He says, how can you do that, God? Because the Babylonians are far worse than your people. Where's the justice in that? You see, Habakkuk, he's looking all around, and there's just injustice everywhere. Even when he looks to God, he can't figure out why God is going to use such immoral people to punish his people. So for Habakkuk, he was going to have to be patient and understanding with the world in which he was living and within the context of God's purposes. In Habakkuk chapter 2, in verses 3 and 4, the passage says, "For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end, it will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come, it will not delay. Behold, his soul is puffed up, it is not upright within him. But the righteous shall live by his faith." As bad as the society was in Habakkuk's day, the situation was just going to become worse. When you could read about the horrors of the Babylonian Empire and what they did in conquering the world, what they eventually did when they came and meted out God's judgment against the people. So what was Habakkuk to do? What were those who were like Habakkuk, those who were living in trust of God? They would have to live by their faith. The righteous shall live by his faith. Do you have faith? Do you have faith in God? Do you have faith in what God has accomplished through his Son? Do you have faith in the promises that God has made for his people? Do you have faith in that? Do you have faith in the fact that God has promised that one day he's going to set the world aright? Do you believe that? Well, as you look around in your life and in your world and things are coming undone, and you're trying to make sense of it all, what are you supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to simply live by my faith that God's going to keep his promises. That one day he's going to set everything right. And when that happens, there won't be any disappointment. And those who have been justified. That's the point that the writer in Hebrews is trying to get across to these saints. Christians who had grown weary in the world, Christians who had become negligent in their faith, Christians who were starting to drift away, starting to turn their back on the cross of Christ, Christians who were under real, direct pressures, persecution, hardships. He says, therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. And then in the next verse, he quotes from Habakkuk 2 and verse 4. God's people have always needed to be encouraged to be patient, especially when they don't understand why. When they don't understand how any good can come out of all that's wrong in the world and in their lives, our confidence has great reward. Peter says that the end of our faith, do you remember what the end of our faith is? He says the end of our faith is the salvation of our souls. Our confidence has great reward. So be patient. Endure. Rely on what God has promised. Rely on His Son. So living by faith means relying on God, not ourselves. Relying on God and not ourselves. Let's get more into the dynamic of Habakkuk's writing. In the second chapter, there are 5 woes that Habakkuk gives. 5 different areas of condemnation that he addresses. 5 things that are wrong and unjust and immoral and wicked in his society. In the last of that series of 5 woes, he pronounces one against idolatry. He asks, what profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it? A metal image, a teacher of lies. For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in it. But the Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before Him. Do you realize when we start to move away from God and rely on ourselves, when we rely on things that we have made, we are in the process of becoming idolaters. It is just that plain and simple. Idolatry is mocked in this text. And there are several places in the Old Testament where idolatry is mocked. Isaiah mocks it in a similar fashion that Habakkuk does. You think of perhaps Elijah at Mount Carmel making fun of the prophets of Baal as they did all kinds of things to gain the attention of their idol. What he says here of the idol, number one, you've constructed it, you've made it, you're the maker. Why would you think that it can do something greater than your own abilities? Then he says, well, the idol doesn't have any ability, it can't speak. I call your attention to what he says in this last line, that there is no breath in it at all. There's no life. There's no life in an idol. Yet, when we start relying on ourselves and all of the things that we've made, we try to find life in it. We try to save life through our idols. In doing that, there's no hope. Now, we can see the absurdity when we read a passage like that. We can see the absurdity of it when we read about Elijah at Mount Carmel and how ridiculous idolatry is, yet we struggle with it. When we try to solve our problems by ourselves, try to find solutions to our sin within ourselves, often we only make matters worse. Now, there's no life in our idols. Eventually, there will be no life in us. We can't give it. We're entirely dependent upon God. Habakkuk draws his readers back to the Lord in His holy temple. Number one, that's assuring. Faith needs assurance, doesn't it? In Habakkuk's time, when everything's coming undone and when it's going to get even worse once the Babylonians come in, when everyone's life is turned upside down and inside out and they're taken into a foreign land, yes, faith would need some assurance then, to be sure. The Lord is in His holy temple. The Lord rules, He reigns, He has command over heaven and earth. He has command over the affairs of us. And when it appears that, to use the expression of the Psalms, when the foundations are shaken, we can rest assured that God is in His holy temple. It's quite an image that's depicted in Revelation. Near the end of some very terrible scenes of prophecy of some horrible things to come, the temple of the Lord is depicted in heaven. Unaffected, unthreatened by the devil and his adversaries who work against him. God's right where He has always been. Therefore, He's accessible. Hebrews, we've been studying, is showing us how we have a great high priest who's gone into the very presence of God, making reconciliation for us through His blood, which was sacrificed once and for all at the cross. Therefore, our hope is anchored in Him, anchored into the presence of God. We must not let go of Christ. He's our only hope of being united with God in eternity. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verses 8 through 10, Paul reflects on a very difficult period in his life when his faith was tested. He says, "For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death, but it was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and He will deliver us. On Him we have set our hope that He will deliver us again." What a great passage. So often we look at Paul and we sort of put him up on a pedestal and we think that Paul just had it made. He never had a bad day. No struggles, no challenges. Read 2 Corinthians, where he pours out his heart to those saints to let them know of what happened to us when we were in Asia. What happened, Paul? He doesn't give us all of the details. Whatever it was horrible. Whatever it was, he thought it was the end. Whatever it was, he wished he was dead. We despaired of life itself. But somehow they got through that. He got through that. How? Well, he doesn't write about himself, does he? He writes about God. Why? What did he learn through this? We learn not to rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. What a statement of faith. God who raises the dead, God who delivers. He rescues. Time and again. Time and again. Paul was hopeful that God would rescue them again. Eventually, though, Paul's life came to an end in an act of injustice. What hope did he have there? Well, this was the hope that he had. His hope was in the God who raises the dead. Paul had hope of eternal life. Paul had the same hope that you and I have. Hope that needs our faith to give us energy. Living by faith means that we rely on God, not ourselves. Those moments of adversity and struggle are opportunities for us to draw nearer to God, to dig our faith deeper. Ultimately, though, living by faith leads to joy. Living by faith leads to joy. If you read through Habakkuk, if you read through Hebrews and read about some of the struggles they were having, you read about Paul and you think, How could living by faith lead to joy? I mean, I'm thankful I wasn't born in the time of Habakkuk. Some people look back on the past with nostalgia, and they think, well, if I could have just been born back here, and be careful. And that's not a period of time that I don't think you'd want to have lived in the 1800s, much less in the days of Habakkuk. But yet we find that living by faith leads to joy. And time and again, it led to joy. This book, as dark as it is, ends with a benediction of joy. Though the fig tree should not blossom, he says, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the folds, and there be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. What he says in verse 18 is quite depressing. He's writing about a time of desolation, the time of depression. This is the kind of thing that would happen when an army lays siege to a city, a place where there isn't food, there's no produce, economic decline, a place where all hope would be lost. All of the aspects of civilization that we typically rely on, stripped away. Yet, Habakkuk says, I will rejoice in the Lord. This is the conclusion to his prayer. He doesn't understand why God allows injustice among His people. He doesn't understand why God is going to use such wicked people to punish His people. But yet God has made promises that He believed in, promises He had committed His life to, promises that would see Him through to the end. So he would rejoice in the Lord. No, Habakkuk was not happy about what he was seeing. He wasn't going to be happy about what he was going to experience. But all of that injustice and sadness could not take away the calm and the peace that he had, that God was going to make all things right. He would trust in the God of his salvation. God was his strength. God is our strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places, the tableland that the psalmists write about, that we sing about from time to time. The tableland is where the pastures were. It's where the food was. There's a contrast here. There's no food in what's described in verse 18. But yet God, His strength, would provide him, would take care of him. In Hebrews chapter 12, in the first 2 verses, we're reminded about our Savior. He says to let us lay aside every weight and the sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. The writer says, ultimately we are to look to Jesus. Jesus demonstrates to us how faith leads to joy. How can we connect joy to the cross? What joy was there in Jesus as he's nailed to the cross? He certainly wasn't happy about what was going on. We think of his prayer to his Father, begging God to change his future. There's nothing about the cross that he wanted to experience. Yet he had faith in God. He had faith in the purposes of God. Do you realize what was going to be accomplished through his sacrifice? That's what Jesus understood. Knowing that his death was going to offer forgiveness for the sins of the world, knowing that his death was going to defeat the devil, brought him joy. Good was going to come out of his sacrifice. And so he went to the cross with faith that God would save him in death. Which is why this writer says ultimately, we look to him. We look to him for our strength, to increase our faith, to endure the hardships of life joyously in the hopes of being with him eternally. Yes, it is a true statement. The just shall live by faith. Habakkuk's motto. Jews who had become Christians, who were well acquainted with Habakkuk, yes, this statement would have become a resounding motto, an anthem to encourage them through their persecution. If there's someone here tonight who needs to be encouraged, I hope a reminder by a lesson like this can do that. Can build you up and strengthen you. If there's someone here tonight who desires the prayers of the church for strength to encourage you, we'd pray for you. Perhaps as a child of God, there's sin in your life tonight and you'd like to make a confession of that to seek restoration. We can pray for you. Perhaps you've not been justified by faith in the first place. You can obey the gospel and begin living the kind of life that we've talked about this evening. If we can help you, in your salvation, please come forward right now as together we stand and sing.